So let's get into it. I actually wanted to use ChatGPT to kind of help dissect this, and I'm gonna bring up the specific question that I asked ChatGPT and what the response was, and kind of breaking this down. And one of the things I noticed is that, you know, being a brown woman myself, it's fascinating to me. Depending on who I come across, they're perceiving me a certain way, categorizing me under different ethnicities based on their own awareness about. Right. I guess there are observations about what certain looks categorize under certain ethnicities. I get categorized around under, I guess, every brown ethnicity that exists here in the US, which has been really interesting. But here we go. Here's the question. I'm going to break it down. And I think I've noticed some of my other fellow international friends also struggle in understanding conceptually, terms like person of color, woman of color, and what that really entails. And based on certain historical circumstances that United States has gone through and how these terms came into definition. So here we go. So break down the concept of woman of color, person of color for me, and which cultural matrix do these terms fit into? Is it used worldwide? Is it just a categorization within the American culture? So here we go. So here's the breakdown. These terms aren't just neutral labels, they're more like cultural tools forged in a very specific historical furnace. Once you see that furnace, the terms start to make sense. And it started to make sense to me more in my 20s, where I was like, all right, what is going on? And where do I fit into this equation of these categorizations and perceptions within this US culture, right? So, what does person of color mean? Person of color is an umbrella term that generally refers to anyone who is not considered white in a given social context. So it groups together people of African, Asian, Latin American, Indigenous, Middle Eastern descent sometimes. The key idea is not biology, but shared experiences of racialization, meaning how societies treat people differently used on perceived race. Think of it less like a scientific category and more like a coalition label, a way of saying different histories but overlapping experiences of marginalization. Yes, so I don't know, it's really interesting sometimes. I don't think many people are necessarily even aware of terms like person of color, even people that grew up in the US. And that speaks to, typically if you fall under the categorized as Caucasian, you generally don't encounter those terms being addressed towards you. So you don't, and yeah, typically they're not aware. And it's innocent, and, I've come across that. So that's been interesting to also see that some people are not even aware that these terms exist. What does woman of color mean? So, woman of color narrows that lens further. It refers to non white women, but importantly, it highlights intersectionality, a concept developed by Kimberly Crenshaw. Look up who she is. Intersectionality means overlapping systems of disadvantage. So, women of color may experience racism, like men of color, sexism, like white women, plus a unique combination of both. It's not just racism plus sexism, it's a distinct lived reality that isn't reducible to either one alone. So, what cultural matrix do these terms belong to? So, if I have people living outside the US who are not aware of this, you might be intrigued by it because certainly I don't think that European society uses these terms in their vernacular, in their language to address people that are non white, not that I have seen. So, this is really interesting and it's specific in the US cultural matrix, which I realized in my long back. So that's been an interesting variation. These terms come out of a very specific intellectual and historical ecosystem. American racial history, so which is rooted in the legacy of slavery in the United States and the Jim Crow laws. The US developed a binary racial framework, white versus non-white. Civil rights and post 1960s activism, terms like people of color gained traction as a solidarity building phrase. So, influenced by movements around Black liberation, Chicano activism, Chicano is reference to Chicano is a term reference to people from Latin America, Latinos, Latinas, Asian American identity formation. Academic frameworks, especially sociology, critical race theory, gender studies. This is where terms like intersectionality, racialization, systemic inequality were formalized and spread. Is this used worldwide? Is the terms people of color, women of color used worldwide? No, not in the same way. Outside the US, these terms often don't translate cleanly, can feel foreign or imposed, sometimes even misinterpret local realities. Why? Because race works differently in different places. Examples. Let's take France. France officially rejects racial categories in public policy, focuses on citizenship and not race. Person of color is used informally but not controversial. Next, Brazil has a spectrum of racial categories, not binary like the US. Identity is fluid and tied to appearance, class, and context. Person of color flattens this complexity. Interesting. I actually didn't know that about Brazil. Next, India. India has a social hierarchy and is structured more around caste, not race. Yes, I've seen that. A dark skinned Indian person is not typically called a person of color locally. But there's another phenomena that happens in India called colorism, which I have seen, I'm of Indian descent, and I've seen other women talk about this. There's this kind of discrimination against women of kind of darker skin color, and it's certainly some progress from that. I have yet to talk to some people to get their experience on this. Next, African countries. Majority populations are black, so person of color doesn't function meaningfully in the same way. So, what are these terms really? They are best understood as context dependent social categories, born in American discourse, used to describe patterns of power, not just identity. They are politically useful in some contexts, coalition building, overly broad in others, flattening differences. So here we go. Key tension. There's an ongoing debate. Pros build solidarity across groups, highlight systemic inequality, creates shared language. I mean, there's no deviating away from using those terms. It's now seeped and integrated so deep into the cultural matrix of the US, and you can't undo history. So I guess it's a way to kind of um, give some definition and kind of cause and effect of events that have happened in the US here historically. And as we know, history is still shaping and affecting our present today. Critiques erases important cultural differences. Yes, having that binary white, non-white categorization, it takes away kind of the complexity of the melting pot nature of the US. And yeah, it doesn't do it service. And I do notice that a lot of people, because we work in a globalized um, globalization has taken place in the world. So a lot of big organizations, we have people from all over the world working and trying to make sense of the US cultural matrix. And I've had instances where I clearly identify as, woman of color, person of color, and my fellow colleague just not in their reality matrix. They're like, what the hell does that word even mean? Centers an American worldview globally can feel reductive or imposed outside the US. If you want a simple way to hold this, race categories are local maps of power. Person of color is a map drawn in the US. It's not really categorization that's used outside the US. Using it elsewhere, overlaying that map onto different terrain. Sometimes it helps you navigate, sometimes it makes you lost. All right. Well, I appreciated that breakdown from ChatGPT. And yeah, I really wanted to talk about this topic and felt right to do this episode because it's very relatable to me. And again, like I said, it's been interesting that not everyone necessarily even uses that categorization. It's, from my perspective, insignificant and only significant within the US cultural matrix. I think that as humans, we always use categorization as a way to organize information in our brains and to make sense of the world. So this has been inevitably, right, a way of categorization, again, due to historical events. And let me end my episode here. And I hope that me going over this has not offended anybody. I don't think I have said anything to particularly activate anything in anybody. But if it does, just, you can DM me, comment. This is just my intention with sharing this is to share my own experiences and to also bring light to whoever's listening in, even outside the US, that these categorizations exist. And if you ever end up talking to, someone from the US cultural matrix and they use these terms, now you have kind of context of where they're coming from. And for those that had never had to encounter these terms being used upon you, well, now at least you're aware of what these terms entail. Well, stay tuned for my next episode. Peace.